It was November 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Flinders Ranges in South Australia. I had been planning it for months, reading maps, checking gear, and loading up the old Toyota Hilux I'd been using for the past few years. I was 34 back then, working in Adelaide as a mechanic, and just needed a break from the noise, the customers, the long hours. Camping had always been something that helped clear my head. I'd grown up doing it with my uncle in the Peninsula, and I still had most of the old gear we used back then. I left the city early on a Friday morning, around 5 a.m. The plan was to drive north along the highway until I hit Hawker, then take the dirt tracks out toward the more remote campsites along the eastern side of the national park. I wasn't going to any official campsite with signs or toilets or other people. I was after complete isolation. I'd marked a few likely spots on my map using satellite images and trip reports I'd found on a forum. Most of them were near dry creek beds or tucked behind low hills where the wind didn't hit too hard. The drive was smooth. I had the music low, the air dry and warm, and the smell of diesel always slightly in the air. Once I passed Corn, traffic dropped off almost entirely. The last other car I saw was a rust-red 4WD pulling out of a side road with a couple of kids in the back, heading back toward the main road. After that, it was just bushland and gravel, red dust and sun. I felt that familiar calm settle over me, like my mind stopped spinning for the first time in months. I reached the area I'd picked around 2:30 in the afternoon. It was a flat stretch of semi-arid land, scattered with gray-green saltbush and small gums twisted by years of wind. To the west, a line of low rocky hills ran like a spine across the land, casting long shadows as the sun dipped. I parked the Uda under one of the larger trees and set up my swag nearby. Nothing fancy, just a canvas bedroll, a small folding table, my cooker, and a 20-liter jerry can of water. The first night was peaceful. A light breeze passed through the trees, and the silence was almost absolute. No traffic, no voices, no power lines humming. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans and sausages, and stared up at the stars for hours. Out here, the sky was so wide it felt like the earth had dropped away beneath me. The Milky Way stretched overhead, dense and brilliant. I slept well that night, even with the occasional rustle of a kangaroo or the soft scurry of something small in the grass. I always sleep light when I'm camping alone, but nothing stood out to me. Not then. The next morning, I got up before sunrise and boiled water for tea. The air was crisp, and I pulled on a jumper. I checked around my site like I always did. No signs of animals getting into my stuff, no footprints that weren't mine. I took a short walk around the area, maybe half a kilometer out and back, just to get my bearings. The place felt just as empty as it looked. It wasn't until the second night that something started to feel off. It had been another quiet day. I'd spent hours just reading, dozing in the shade, watching birds come and go from a nearby tree. Around sunset, I went a bit farther out, climbing halfway up one of the rocky hills to get a better view of the land. That's when I saw something strange in the distance. It looked like a person standing still, maybe a couple hundred meters away, near the edge of a dry creek. They weren't moving, just standing there. I squinted. I could barely make out details, just the dark shape of someone upright, too still to be an animal. No vehicle nearby.
No gear.
They weren't waving or doing anything that suggested they wanted help. Just standing. I watched for a minute or two. Then the shape moved slowly and stepped back toward the trees until it was gone. I stayed on the hill for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Could have been a farmer or another camper. Maybe even someone hunting feral goats out here. But the way they'd stood so still, the way they moved back without any sign of recognition, it felt wrong. I didn't have binoculars with me, so I couldn't be sure of anything. Eventually, I walked back down, trying to shake it off. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. The breeze had picked up a little, making the trees creak and whisper. I laid in my swag with one arm out, hand resting on the handle of the knife I kept close. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy. Every little sound seemed louder. At some point, I dozed off. I woke up again just before dawn. The sky was just starting to brighten in the east, casting the land in pale gray. I sat up and looked around instinctively. That's when I saw footprints. Not mine. These were fresh and spaced differently. Wider apart. Heavier. They came from the direction of the trees where I'd seen the figure and circled the area where I'd set up camp. They didn't go right up to my swag, but they passed maybe 15 meters away, looping around and heading back the way they came. I felt my skin go cold. Someone had been walking around my site while I was asleep. I spent an hour checking the area in daylight. No sign of gear, no vehicle tracks, no camping setup nearby. Just footprints in the fine dust. I followed them as far as I could toward the creek before they faded into the scrub. No indication of where the person came from or went. I packed up that morning. I didn't want to just bolt, but I didn't want to stay in the same exact spot either. I drove a few kilometers east, off the track, and found another spot near a low ridge. I set up again, but lighter this time, kept most of my gear in the Uda. I was debating cutting the trip short, maybe heading back the next day. The day passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I caught myself turning around fast when a bird flapped overhead, my heart pounding. I wasn't even sure what I expected to see. When night came, I parked the Uda close to the ridge and laid my swag in the tray instead of on the ground. I figured it was safer to be slightly elevated. I kept the keys in my pocket and the driver's side window cracked open just enough to hear sounds from outside. I left the knife on my chest and a flashlight in my hand. Around 1 a.m., I heard a noise that didn't fit. It was soft, like a footstep on gravel. Then another. I didn't move. I just listened. More footsteps. Close. Slow. Deliberate. Not an animal. Not random rustling. Someone was walking near the Uda. I stayed dead still, breathing through my nose, ears straining. Then I saw it. Just a flash of a figure moving past the rear of the Uda.
No flashlight.
No sound of breathing or voice. Just the shape of a man, head low, moving slow. He walked past the passenger side, toward the front, then vanished from view. I stayed there, frozen, heart thudding so hard I could hear it. Minutes passed. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I waited, gripping the flashlight and knife so hard my hands hurt. Finally, I flicked the flashlight on and shone it around fast. Nothing. I sat up in the tray and scanned the area. No sign of anyone. I jumped down, backed up toward the driver's side, and got in. I turned the key, fired up the engine, and kept the headlights off. I rolled away in low gear, slowly, until I was back on the track. I didn't stop until I reached a rest area near Wilpena Pound an hour later, one of the few official campgrounds nearby. There were other campers there.
Caravans.
Tents. Families. I parked near the edge of the site and locked everything. I didn't sleep, just sat in the driver's seat, knife in hand, until the sun came up. That morning, I reported the incident to a ranger at the visitor center. I didn't have much to tell them. No clear description, no photos, just the story. He listened, nodded, and told me I wasn't the first person to report strange encounters near the creek that year. No crimes, no assaults, but a handful of solo hikers and campers had come back early, spooked by someone or something in the bush. I drove back to Adelaide that afternoon. I haven't been camping alone since. I still think about that trip sometimes. The way that man moved, the silence of it, the footprints, the fact that he didn't try to talk, didn't carry a light, didn't seem to have a camp of his own. Just there, walking around in the dark. I'll never know what he wanted. Maybe he was just another loner, someone with their own reasons for being out there. But I don't believe that. Not deep down. Not after the way he circled my camp. Not after the second night. Sometimes, late at night when it's quiet, I hear those footsteps again in my head. The slow, careful ones in the dust. And I wonder how close he really got. My name is Daniel, and this happened in the summer of 2016. I was 28 at the time, working as a freelance photographer based out of Boise, Idaho. That summer, I took a few weeks off to drive down through Utah and into Arizona. I wasn't doing it for work. I just wanted to disappear for a while and be out in the open. I loved being on the road, especially in that part of the country. Vast land, empty highways, red dust everywhere, and barely any cell service. It gave me peace. I planned to spend 2 nights camping alone in the Kaibab National Forest, just north of the Grand Canyon. I'd stayed there before, about 2 years earlier with an ex-girlfriend, and remembered it being quiet, remote, and easy to find a place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. That was exactly what I was after. I didn't want anything fancy, just my tent, a cooler full of food, some water, my camera gear, and the silence. I got there around 4 p.m. and drove several miles down a dusty forest road until I found a pull-off that led to a small clearing. There weren't any marked campsites around, no signage, nothing. It was just a flat area surrounded by tall pine trees and dry brush, with a bit of shade and enough space to set up my tent. I parked the car facing out toward the road, popped the trunk, and started unloading. The sun was still up when I finished setting up my camp. I had my tent a good 10 feet from the fire pit I dug and ringed with stones. I always did that part first. It helped me feel settled. The trees around me were thick, and there was no sign of anyone else nearby. I hadn't passed another car in at least 40 minutes of driving through the forest roads. As evening settled in, the air cooled quickly. I made a small fire, warmed up a can of beans, and ate while sitting on a fold-out chair. My camera was beside me, and I had already taken some photos of the clearing, the trees, and the light filtering through the branches. Felt calm. The kind of calm you only get when you're far from everything. No cars, no buzzing phones, no voices. Just wind, birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves. The first night was uneventful. I heard coyotes in the distance at some point after midnight, but that's nothing new out here. Their yipping and howling faded after a while, and I drifted off to sleep again. When I woke up, it was just after 7 a.m. The sun was already high, and the air was warming up. That second day, I explored the woods a little, took some photos, and kept mostly close to the camp. I wasn't in a rush. Around noon, I noticed some tracks in the dirt near a patch of grass a few yards behind my tent. At first, I thought they might have been from a deer or maybe a small elk, but they weren't quite right. The prints looked wrong, too long and not rounded like hooves, more like someone walking barefoot, but oddly shaped. I figured it was probably just my imagination or the erosion of the dirt messing with the shape. I tried to brush it off. There were no other vehicles around, and I hadn't seen a single person in over 24 hours. By sunset, I felt a little unsettled. I don't know what changed exactly. The woods felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just something in the air, like a stillness that didn't feel natural. No wind, no animal sounds, no insects. Even the birds had gone quiet. I told myself it was probably just the time of day, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I made a bigger fire than the first night and sat closer to it. I didn't touch the camera that evening. I just sat, ate a granola bar, and listened to the silence. The feeling got worse as the sky darkened. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd hear a short, sudden sound. A twig snap, dry brush crunching, just barely beyond the firelight. I'd freeze and stare, trying to see something, but it was always just darkness. The trees were dense, and shadows moved strangely between them. Once or twice I thought I saw movement like a shape shifting between trunks, but nothing ever stepped into view. I didn't call out. I didn't want to break the silence. That night I didn't sleep well. I zipped the tent fully closed and kept a knife close by. The wind picked up a bit around midnight, and it carried sounds I couldn't quite place. Not words, not voices, just tones. Echoes, maybe. I kept telling myself it was just the wind or animals in the distance. But every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something else, soft thumps, like footsteps, but too slow and spread apart to be a deer. They stopped and started again, like something pacing outside my tent. I laid there frozen, barely breathing, until the sky lightened with dawn. When I finally stepped out of the tent, the fire had died to ash. My car was untouched, but when I walked a few feet beyond the edge of camp, I found more tracks, bigger this time and more defined. They were definitely not animal. Barefoot prints, long and narrow, but with toes that looked wrong. Not fully human, too long with deep impressions like claws. That's when I knew I had to leave. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed as quickly as I could, tossing things haphazardly into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted out of there. The road back was rough and slow, and the farther I got from that clearing, the more I could breathe again. But just before I reached the main road, maybe 5 or 6 miles out from camp, I saw something. It was standing near the tree line to my right. First, I thought it was a man. It looked like one, tall, skinny, and naked, but it didn't move like a person. It was stiff, hunched slightly forward, and its skin looked off, pale and tight, stretched like it had been pulled over bone. Its face was wrong too. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw it smiling. Not a normal smile, but one that stretched too wide, like it was trying to copy what a person's face should look like, but hadn't figured it out yet. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I stared straight ahead and drove until I hit pavement again. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to know if it had moved. I got to a gas station about 30 miles north, near Jacob Lake. I filled the tank with shaking hands and went inside for coffee. I must have looked like hell. The clerk asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and got back in the car. I didn't speak to anyone until I got home. It's been years now, and I haven't camped alone since. I still go out into the woods, but always with someone else. I can't explain what I saw, and I don't care to try. Maybe there are things out there we weren't meant to understand. Maybe some places don't want us there. I don't know if what I saw was a person or something trying to be one. But I do know this. Something watched me that night in the forest. Something that waited until I was alone and vulnerable, and it followed me long enough to make sure I knew it was real. I don't tell this story to most people. They wouldn't believe it. But I know what I saw, and I won't ever forget it. That thing in the woods wasn't human, and it didn't want me to leave, but I did, and I'm never going back. I was 23 the summer I camped out in a graveyard. It was 2013, and I had just finished college in Leeds. A few friends and I were still hanging around Yorkshire before real jobs pulled us into separate lives. We weren't kids anymore, but we didn't feel like adults either. Most nights were just beer and campfires or hiking trails with secondhand gear. It was harmless stuff, but as the summer dragged on, we got bored. That kind of boredom that makes you push things further just to feel something again. That's how the graveyard idea came up. One of the guys mentioned it half-jokingly. Spend a night alone in an old cemetery outside town. No phones. No flashlight unless absolutely necessary. Sleep on the ground. Bring a tent if you want, but it had to be inside the fence. That was the rule. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to be the one who backed down. Maybe I thought it would be funny. But 2 days later, I packed a small backpack with a tent, a water bottle, some crackers, a basic knife, and a hoodie, and I walked alone to Holmwood Cemetery. The place was a few miles outside the village of Holmwood, a small, dying place that hadn't seen real life in decades. The cemetery was on a hill past the woods, next to a crumbling stone church no one had used in years. Locals said it had been closed after part of the roof collapsed, and then never repaired. The cemetery remained open for a few more years, but it filled up fast, and now it just sat there, overgrown and forgotten. I arrived just before sunset, around 7:30 p.m. I walked the narrow trail through the woods, my backpack bumping against me. Birds chirped loudly at that hour, and bugs floated through the humid air. When I stepped out of the woods and into the clearing, the sight of the cemetery hit me harder than I expected. It was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural even when you know it's not. The old iron fence surrounded the place in a loose square, rusted in parts, twisted in others. Several of the gravestones were leaning or toppled over. Weeds choked out the rows. It looked like the land had been trying to swallow the place for years. The church was about 30 feet away from the center of the cemetery. Its roof was half gone, and the bell tower looked like it might collapse in the next big storm. Most of the windows were missing or broken, and ivy climbed up the stone like veins. The graveyard itself was uneven, sloping gently downhill toward the back, where trees stood at the edge like silent guards. I opened the gate, which groaned like a wounded animal. No one was around, no houses nearby, no traffic. I was completely alone. I picked a spot close to the edge but still inside the fence. I didn't want to be right in the center. Something about that made me uncomfortable. I found a patch of grass between two headstones, both unreadable from erosion, and pitched my small tent. I kept my pack inside, zipped it up, and took a long look around. Nothing moved. There was no wind. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky orange and soft. I pulled out a small camp chair and sat outside the tent, chewing on some crackers and trying to feel brave. As darkness fell, I started to notice more. Gravestones don't feel like much when you visit during the day, but at night, they seem to rise from the ground. Their shadows stretch in weird ways. The longer I looked at them, the more I imagined things. Shapes between them, gaps where someone might stand. I shook those thoughts off. Just nerves. I checked my watch, 9:15. Still early. The bugs came out in full. The kind that buzz right past your ear and disappear. I swatted at them, got up, walked a little between the rows, just to shake off the weird energy building up in me. It wasn't long after that when I noticed the first real strange thing. There was a fresh patch of dirt near the back of the cemetery. It stood out because everything else was overgrown and collapsed, but this was a clean rectangle, about the size of a grave. The soil looked like it had been turned recently. No grass, no weeds, just dark earth packed tight. There was no headstone at the top of it, no marker, just this rectangle of soil, fresh and new, surrounded by 30-year-old graves. I stood there looking at it for too long. I told myself someone had buried a pet, or maybe it was just an illusion from the moonlight, but the dirt was real. I could smell it, damp and sharp, and it wasn't dry like the rest of the ground. I didn't want to stare anymore, so I went back to the tent and sat down. Time dragged. It always does when you're alone. I didn't have my phone, part of the dare. I just sat there, sipping warm water and watching the night take over. At some point, I laid down in the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep, not really. Just lay there with my eyes open, listening. The air was thick with insect sounds, but they would stop every now and then for no reason, like the whole world was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard movement. Not leaves or wind, this was heavy, measured, like a person walking, I stayed absolutely still. It came from the far side of the cemetery, near the church. A long pause, then another slow crunch of footfall. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My fingers were clenched around the handle of the little knife I'd brought, still inside my bag. My tent was silent, and I hoped, desperately, that whatever was out there would just pass through. The steps stopped. For a minute, there was only the sound of blood rushing in my ears. Then the gate squealed again, slowly, not being pushed open but moved just enough to make it sound. Then silence again. I must have laid there for an hour before I moved. My muscles were stiff. My mouth was dry. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I didn't want to look, but I had to pee, badly. Couldn't hold it anymore. So finally, I unzipped the tent, scanned around with the dim light of a tiny keychain flashlight I had kept in my pocket, and stepped out. Everything looked the same, empty. The gate stood slightly more ajar than I remembered, but maybe I just hadn't closed it right. I walked off to the side, past a cluster of graves, and relieved myself behind a leaning stone. I didn't linger. I was already feeling cold despite the summer night. Something had shifted out here. I went back into the tent and zipped up again. This time I kept the knife beside me, just in case. I slept in short, shallow bursts, dreams mixed with reality, and I kept waking up thinking I heard breathing outside. But when I listened closely, I heard nothing. Stillness, utter stillness. Just before dawn, I sat up and rubbed my face. I figured if I made it through the night, I could call it a win and pack up. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not mine. They led from the far side of the cemetery, past the church ruins, toward the tent. The prints were faint but real. The grass was pressed down. Some patches of mud stuck to the trail. They stopped about 10 feet from where I slept. Just stopped. No return trail. No deviation. Just a straight line from the back of the graveyard to a spot near my tent. And then nothing. I followed them backward, heart racing. The prints led to the fresh dirt. That new patch. Now, something was sticking out of it. A little metal stake. No, not a stake, a shovel handle. Just the very top. Someone had buried a shovel in that fresh patch of dirt. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. I would have seen it. I stood there frozen, staring at the dirt, the shovel, the footprints. Who the hell had been out here in the middle of the night? And why had they walked right up to my tent and then left no further trail? I packed my gear in 10 minutes flat. Didn't even fold the tent properly. I threw everything in the backpack and walked fast. Almost ran. Back through the woods toward the road. When I got back to town, I didn't say anything to the others. I just told them I did the dare and passed. They cheered, laughed, offered me a beer. I played along. But a week later, I went back to the cemetery during the day. Couldn't help it. I needed to know if it was real or if I'd imagined everything in a sleep-deprived haze. The graveyard looked the same, but the fresh dirt was gone. Not overgrown, just gone. The patch was now grass like everywhere else. No shovel, no stake, nothing. But something else was different. There was a new grave marker. A flat stone, gray and clean. No name, just the date. August 12th, 2013. The exact night I had camped there. No one buried a body out there officially. I checked records. I asked a guy who worked at a council office in Chesterfield. He laughed and said the place hadn't had a burial in 30 years. I asked again, pressed him. He looked annoyed. There's no one buried out there recently, he told me. Unless someone did it illegally. That grave marker still had no name on it. Just the date. I've never gone back. I never told the full story until now. I don't even know who or what was out there that night. No ghost. No monsters. Just a person. Or worse, people. I've thought about it for years, and the only conclusion I've come to is this. Someone buried something out there. and they didn't want me to see it. Maybe they thought I was asleep. Maybe they were watching me all night. Maybe they meant to come back and finish something they started. But they didn't, and that marker still sits there with that date, slowly being swallowed by time, just like the rest of them. It was late September of 2016, and I was 32 at the time, living in a small apartment in Bristol, England. I worked for a logistics company that kept me indoors all week, glued to screens and phones, and I had started to feel the weight of it building over the summer. By the time September rolled around, I was drained in a way that didn't feel fixed by a good night's sleep. I needed a proper break. Not just a weekend in the city, but real space, the kind where I couldn't hear cars or check my email. So I booked a few days off and decided to head out to the Brecon Beacons in Wales. It wasn't far, about 2.5 hours if traffic was light. I'd gone hiking there a few times with friends years before, but I had never done a solo trip out there. I was craving the silence, just my tent, the sound of wind through the trees, and nothing to bother me. I packed a small rucksack with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a little gas burner, a few packets of dehydrated food, and 2 large bottles of water. I brought a compass and a physical map just in case, something my dad had drilled into me back when he used to take me hill walking. My phone had signal in the lowlands, but I didn't expect it to last. I parked just outside a tiny village called Talabont-on-Usk and hiked for most of the afternoon, heading west into the hills. The forecast had warned of light rain, maybe a heavier patch overnight, but I didn't mind. I had a good tent, and I liked the sound of rain when I was tucked in warm and dry. I wasn't going far, just enough to get away from roads, fences, and the kind of fields that made you feel like you were still close to someone's house. My plan was to camp somewhere halfway up a ridge known as Juan Ryd. The trail twisted up through a dense band of conifers before flattening out into exposed moorland. By the time I found a good flat spot to pitch the tent, the light had started to fade. The wind had picked up a little, rustling through the soaked bracken, but I was sheltered enough by a dip in the land that I didn't feel too exposed. I set up my tent quickly, hammered the stakes deep because I knew the weather might get worse, and climbed inside. The air inside the tent felt colder than I expected. I zipped up, cooked some rice and chicken from a pouch, and sat cross-legged inside with the warm food in my lap, listening to the slow drumbeat of rain starting on the fly sheet. It was peaceful. For the first hour or two, I didn't think of anything except how good it felt to be away from the world. But that feeling didn't last. Somewhere past 10 p.m., the rain thickened, and the wind began to really push against the side of the tent. I was lying in my sleeping bag, headlamp off, just listening. Rain's not something that usually bothers me, but this time it did. Not because of the noise, it was the pattern. It would stop for a few seconds, then come back stronger, then die down like someone fiddling with a volume knob. And in between those patches, there were other noises, faint ones, not the wind, not the flapping of nylon, footsteps. At first, I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a sheep or maybe even a deer, but they didn't move like that. These steps were slow and spaced out, deliberate. They came from the ridge above and moved down along the slope toward where my tent sat in that little hollow. I held my breath and listened. The steps would stop for 10, maybe 15 seconds and then continue. Crunch, pause, crunch. I sat up and reached for the knife I kept in the side pocket of my rucksack. It wasn't much, just a folding blade I used for cooking, but it made me feel a little less exposed. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to give away that I was awake, and I didn't want whatever was out there to know exactly where the opening was. The steps stopped completely after a while, just outside the range where I could tell exactly where they were. The wind rattled the tent harder, shaking the fly sheet in bursts. I waited, heart beating against my ribs, but nothing else happened. No sounds of movement.
No voices.
Eventually, after maybe an hour of silence, I convinced myself I had imagined it. My ears playing tricks in the rain. I told myself I was overtired and probably a bit more on edge than I thought. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. It was that kind of sleep that doesn't feel like it lasts, where your brain keeps half-waking to check if it's still dark or if the sound is still there. When I finally did wake properly, it was maybe 3 in the morning, and the wind was gone. The rain had slowed to a soft mist, but something else was different. The air inside the tent was colder than before. Not just cold wrong. That kind of chill that feels still like the world has stopped moving. I unzipped the sleeping bag halfway and sat up. The inside of the tent was dark, but I could see just enough from the faint glow leaking in from the overcast sky. The flap of the tent was slightly open, just a couple of inches, like something had tugged it and not fully closed it. I know for a fact I had zipped it fully shut before going to bed. I always do. I sat frozen for a minute, staring at the slit of dark outside, not knowing if I should speak, or move, or just wait. My knife was still tucked beside me, and I pulled it into my lap. I didn't hear anything. No movement.
No breathing.
Just the faint tap of mist dripping off leaves and branches outside. After a long pause, I leaned forward and zipped the flap closed again, slow and silent. I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed sitting up, holding that knife in both hands, heart pounding in my throat. At first light, barely a gray smear on the canvas. I packed everything.
Fast.
I didn't even cook breakfast. I just shoved the cold gear into my rucksack and rolled the tent with shaking hands. The trail was slick, and I slipped twice going down the ridge, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the car. But something didn't feel right on the walk back. Every few minutes, I'd get that feeling, like someone was watching me from behind. Once, I stopped and turned, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw something move behind the trees uphill. A shadow slipping behind a thick trunk. Could have been nothing, but I didn't wait around to check. When I finally got back to the village and the small gravel lay by where I'd parked, my car was the only one there. But there were fresh tire tracks in the mud next to it, deep ones wider than my hatchback's tires. I looked around. No other hikers, no dog walkers.
No farmers.
Just quiet, wet silence and mist hanging low over the fields. I threw my gear in the back seat and locked the doors. I drove home without stopping once, barely blinking at the road. Even once I got back to the safety of my flat, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about the flap of the tent, the slow footsteps, the tire tracks. I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I say? That I thought someone might have walked through the rain at night just to stand outside my tent and pull the zip down an inch? Even I didn't believe it at the time. But a few days later, I was still thinking about it. I ended up looking through local news from that area. Not recent stuff, older. I was curious if anything strange had happened in those hills over the years. There wasn't much, but I did find something from 2007. A hiker had gone missing in that same part of the ridge. Mid-30s.
Solo camper.
Never found. Police suspected exposure, maybe an accident. But there were comments underneath the article, locals talking about strange things they'd heard over the years. One person mentioned the man who lives wild up there, not right in the head. Another said they had once come across an old fire pit and some bones, but didn't say where. I don't know if any of that was true. Maybe it was just folklore. Maybe my mind was just connecting dots that didn't belong together. But I haven't gone camping alone since then. Not in the UK. Not anywhere. I still love the hills. I still love the quiet. But now I book cabins. I stay near other people. I carry more than a pocket knife. And when it rains at night and I'm lying in bed listening to it on the roof, I still hear that sound in my head. The slow, wet crunch of footsteps coming toward my tent, stopping just before they reach me. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know what I felt, and that's enough. It was in the fall of 2011 when I decided to spend a week out hunting in the valleys near Fetter Creek, up in the northwest part of Montana. I was 36 years old, single, and working a flexible job with the Forest Service back then, which gave me a lot of free time in the off-season. Hunting was something I took seriously, not for sport, but for meat. I'd grown up around it, and I always preferred to fill my freezer with elk and venison rather than make trips to the grocery store every week. That October had been colder than usual. Frost came early and stuck to the grass each morning like crystal powder. I remember loading my truck with gear while my breath came out in thick white clouds. I had everything I needed: a .30-06 bolt action I'd had for years, a solid tent, food, layers of thermals, propane heaters, even a satellite phone, though I didn't expect to need it. I was headed to a place I'd hunted before, where elk moved down out of the higher elevation when the cold settled in. The spot was about 5 hours from Kalispell, and once I got off the logging roads, it was another 2 miles on foot to reach the exact site. It took me most of the first day just to hike in and get set up. The trail wasn't marked. It was one I'd carved out on my own from years of poking around. And by the time I got to the clearing I liked to camp in, it was already late afternoon. The sky had that sharp, fading color you see right before sundown. I cleared some deadfall, set up the tent, and got a small fire going before dark dropped down over the trees. I didn't hear anything strange that night, just the usual things: the distant yelps of coyotes, the creaking of trees, and the constant rustling of wind in the dry leaves. The next morning, I woke up early and packed light. I had a thermos of coffee, a few protein bars, my rifle, and a small orange vest tucked under my jacket just in case someone else wandered into the area, though I didn't expect that either. I started up a slow slope behind the campsite, the kind of place where game trails intersect in a messy crisscross of soft dirt, scattered droppings, and old hoof prints. After about 3 hours of moving carefully and glassing the valley edges with my binoculars, I finally spotted a small herd of elk cutting across a ravine about a half-mile away. There was a large cow at the front, followed by a young spike bull. I tracked them for a while, trying to find a good place to intercept without spooking them. By the time I got within range, I was crouched behind a stump, about 200 yards uphill from where they were feeding in a small meadow. I waited. Eventually, the spike gave me a clean broadside shot, and I took it. The sound cracked across the trees like a baseball bat smacking frozen wood, and the bull jumped and staggered before collapsing on its front legs. It was a clean hit through the lungs. The next few hours were all work. I field dressed the elk on the spot, careful to keep the meat clean and protected. Then I marked the carcass with reflective tape and stashed it under a tarp weighted down with some branches. I only hauled one hindquarter back to camp that day, figuring I'd go back the next morning with the sled to get the rest. That night, I built a stronger fire. The air had dipped below freezing, and the stillness in the woods was complete. I don't remember hearing anything unusual at first, maybe just the faint crunch of snow crust out in the distance. But that's normal. Things shift and break down in the cold. Squirrels, wind, rabbits. You hear things out there all the time, and unless something gets close, you don't pay it much mind. But something did feel off. Not dangerous, just wrong, like I was being watched. That heavy kind of feeling that crawls up your back. I shook it off. I figured it was just the kill, the blood scent, maybe a predator drawn in. I strung the quarter I'd brought back up in a tree about 30 yards from camp, just to be safe. The next morning, I left early with the sled and backpack. The path back to the carcass wasn't long, but it took time. Once I got there, I immediately noticed something wasn't right. The tarp was off, moved maybe 10 feet away. Some of the brush I'd laid down was scattered, and the front shoulder was missing, gone.
No drag marks.
No blood trail, just gone. Now, I've seen what wolves and bears can do. When they hit a carcass, it gets messy. There's hair and scat and broken ribs and trails everywhere. This was clean, too clean. I stopped, stood still for a long time, looked around. Nothing moved.
No birds.
No wind, just dead quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong in the woods. Still, I took what I could carry and headed back, but I had a weird pit in my stomach the whole time. I kept glancing behind me, listening for footsteps. The trees were dense, and everything looked darker than it should have. Back at camp, I found tracks near the edge of the clearing. Not boot tracks, at least not any kind I recognized. They were wide, maybe 13 inches long, deeply pressed into the frost. They didn't have the shape of a normal hiking boot, more like old rubber soles, completely smooth. And they came from the trees, stopped 10 feet from my tent, then doubled back. I hadn't heard a thing the night before. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire going. I kept my rifle close. Around 2 a.m., I heard crunching again. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the brush. They circled the camp. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't shine a light. I just waited, heart pounding. After an hour, the footsteps came again, closer this time, then gone. To first light, I packed up everything. I left the meat. I didn't care. I just wanted out. On the hike back, I found more tracks. Those same smooth-soled prints, spaced evenly like someone walking with a slow, measured gait. No prints of wildlife. No signs of bear. Just those. I made it back to my truck without seeing anything. But when I got there, the driver's side door was open. Not forced, just open. And inside, the map I'd left on the passenger seat was gone. My spare gloves were gone. A half-drunk bottle of water I'd left in the cup holder was now empty, placed upside down on the dash. I left fast. When I got back home, I told myself to forget it, that maybe some trapper had passed through, maybe a poacher, something. But the feeling stuck with me, that sense that something had been watching, that someone had been walking just behind the trees, staying out of sight, waiting. I didn't hunt alone the next season, or the season after that. I only went out with friends and I stayed close to known trails. But even then, part of me never relaxed the same way, because whatever had been out there with me near Fetter Creek, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just passing through. It had known exactly what I was doing, and it didn't want the meat. It wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I was 32 that summer, working in a factory in a small town in eastern Washington. I'd been working the same job since I was 24. It paid well enough and I was used to the routine, but every now and then I'd get this itch to leave town and be out somewhere where there weren't any people. I've always liked being alone in nature. Clears my head. That August, after working 16 straight days of overtime to cover for a guy who broke his wrist, I finally had a long weekend off. I decided to go camping. Not a campground with kids on bikes and minivans lined up. Real camping, backcountry. I wanted to be miles from anything and anyone. I pulled out an old paper map and circled a remote spot near the Patan Wilderness, up by the Canadian border. I'd never camped that far north before, and from what I could tell, it was rugged, remote, and untouched. There was an unmarked trail that followed a dry creek bed up to a high ridge. The map showed a flat clearing up there, a perfect spot to pitch a tent. I packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, a canister stove, some freeze-dried meals, jerky, a few water bottles, water filter, and a small .38 I always brought on solo trips. Not that I ever needed it. I took a Friday off, left town early that morning, and drove 6 hours north, past Winthrop. Then another hour down an unpaved forest road full of washouts and potholes. I parked my truck in a tiny pull-off that barely fit a vehicle. No one else was around. I locked up, slung on my pack, and started walking. It took me about 4 hours to reach the ridge. The trail was steep and mostly gone in places. My shirt was soaked in sweat, and the only sounds I heard were pine needles underfoot, the wind in the trees, and the occasional squirrel skittering away. There were no tire tracks, no boot prints. I knew no one had been up there in a long time. When I reached the top, I found the clearing just like the map said. Flat, dry, and ringed by tall pines. The view was something else. You could see for miles layers of forested hills stretching out like waves. The sky was cloudless, that rich, empty blue that makes you feel small. I set up my tent on the edge of the clearing, just where the trees started again. I got a small fire going, boiled some water, made a bag of beef stroganoff, and sat on a fallen log to eat. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down. I pulled on a jacket and sat close to the fire until it was just embers. That first night was still. So still it was almost unnerving. Usually you hear animals in the woods at night, owls, bugs, distant coyotes. But up there it was dead quiet. I slept okay, though I woke up a couple times from the cold and had to cinch the bag tighter. The next day I explored around camp, hiked eastward a bit and followed the ridge to a higher rise. I found old logging flag tape tied to a branch, faded and cracked. There was no sign of any recent human activity. I felt like I was the only person to set foot there in years. That evening, I made another fire, warmed up some chili, and wrote in the little notepad I brought. I wrote about how quiet it was. I even noted how I hadn't seen any animals at all. No deer, no elk, not even birds. It was like the place was abandoned by wildlife. That felt strange. I started noticing how there were no birds chirping.
No chipmunks.
Even the wind had died down completely. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small noises in the woods near my tent. Not big, crashing noises. Small ones, like twigs snapping or pine cones dropping. I told myself it was just the forest settling or maybe a raccoon. But every time I'd start to drift off, there'd be another sound. Something faint but deliberate. I unzipped the tent and shined my headlamp out, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. I eventually fell asleep again, though I had a weird feeling in my gut, like I was being watched. The next morning, I noticed something odd right away. The fire ring I had built had been disturbed. Not destroyed, just different, like someone had taken a stick and pushed some of the rocks around. I stared at it for a while, wondering if maybe I had done it before bed and forgotten. But I didn't think I had. Then I saw a boot print. It was faint, just one, but it wasn't mine. It was narrower and longer than my foot, and angled toward the trees. I crouched beside it and looked closer. It was fresh. The edges of the print were still sharp, like it had been made that morning or the night before. My heart started beating a little faster. I circled the area, looking for more prints, but I didn't find any, just that one. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing, just the same silence. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it could have been old, could have been made by a hunter or hiker weeks ago and just hadn't been washed away because there'd been no rain. But that didn't explain why there were no other prints. And it didn't explain why the fire ring was messed with. I tried to shake the feeling. I hiked again that day, tried to stay busy. I brought my .38 with me that time and kept it in my coat pocket. I didn't enjoy the hike. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting to see movement in the trees. But there was nothing. I got back to camp by late afternoon and rebuilt the fire. Ate another meal. Felt colder that night, even though the air was clear. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in my bag, fully dressed, gun next to me. I kept the rain fly open so I could see out. The woods were black. I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. But around midnight I heard it again. A soft crunch of footsteps, very faint, not walking fast, just shifting weight. Someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I just stared out at the darkness and waited. The sound stopped. I couldn't tell where it came from. Maybe 10 feet away, maybe 20. I reached over slowly and grabbed the .38. My mouth was dry. I held my breath for what felt like minutes. Then I heard it again. One step, then another, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited for the sun to rise, and as soon as there was enough light to see, I got out of the tent and looked around. I found another print. Same shape, still just one. It was behind the tent, facing it. That was enough. I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't boil water. I just stuffed everything into my bag and started hiking back down. I kept the gun in my hand the whole time. Every snap of a branch made me jump. The hike back took less time, probably because I was moving fast and not taking breaks. But the whole time, I felt like someone was following me. I never saw anyone. I never heard anyone clearly, but I felt it. When I got to my truck, I almost cried. I threw my pack in the bed and drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I made it home that night and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep much for the next few days. A week later, I was still thinking about it. Couldn't stop. I pulled the map out again and looked at the ridge where I'd camped. I did a little digging online, trying to find stories of missing people or weird happenings in that area. I didn't find much, but I did find a very old forum post from a guy who claimed he hiked that same area years ago and felt like he was being stalked. He described the same silence, the same feeling, and the same single boot print. That was all I needed to read. I threw the map away. I haven't been camping alone since. I was 32 when I decided to take a week off from everything and head out to camp alone. It was the summer of 2014, and I'd been working long shifts as a welder in Tallahassee. My body felt like it had been beaten with hammers every day. I wasn't sleeping well. Everything around me just felt heavy. The heat, the noise, the city, people. I needed space. I needed silence. I found an old spot I'd camped at years ago with my older brother, up in the hills near Franklin, North Carolina. We used to go up there in late July, hike for a few miles off any marked trail, then pitch a tent near the ridge where the pines thinned out. No cell signal, no noise, just wind and trees. I remember there was a small spring near the base of the ridge and a view that stretched out past the trees if you went high enough. I hadn't been there in over 10 years, but the memory of it sat in my chest like something clean and untouched. I packed light, one tent, 2 knives, a .38 snub nose I kept for protection, 1 pair of boots, and enough food for 5 days. I brought a journal, a flashlight, and 2 spare batteries. Everything else I figured I could manage without. My Chevy truck got me as far as a gravel road with a rusted gate. From there, I hiked another 3 hours uphill through thick brush, crossing one stream that had almost dried out from the heat. I reached the ridge late in the afternoon, my shirt soaked through and my legs aching. But the view hit me hard. The trees fell away to a wide stretch of sky. Everything below shimmered with the late sun. I didn't realize how much I missed silence until I stood there, alone. I pitched the tent a few feet from the drop-off, where the pine trees opened up and I could see the hills roll out in layers. I built a fire pit with some rocks, got a small fire going with dried sticks and shavings, and heated a can of beans. That night, I sat with my back against a log and stared out past the dark treetops, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to black. No bugs buzzing, no voices, nothing. Just wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I slept better than I had in months. The second day was peaceful. I hiked down the slope and found the old spring. It was still running, though slower than I remembered. I filtered some water and brought it back to camp. Around midday, I spotted what looked like an old boot print in the dirt near the edge of the ridge. I didn't think much of it. Could have been mine from yesterday, or from a hunter or another camper long ago. The dirt was dry, and prints don't last long here. I let it go. The next morning, I woke to the sound of something stepping on sticks near the tent. It was still early, just past dawn. I stayed quiet, listening. Could have been a deer. Black bears passed through these woods sometimes, but they mostly kept away unless you left food out. I hadn't. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing there. No prints, no noise, nothing. Just trees and that smell of morning sap in the air. That night, it got windy. I sat by the fire again, eating jerky and flipping through the old journal I brought. Around midnight, I thought I saw something move near the trees to the west, just a dark shape slipping between trunks. I stared hard for a minute, but it didn't come back. Probably a deer. Could have even been a trick of the firelight. I went to sleep, but something stuck in my head, like a weight pressing down. I don't know what it was, just a bad feeling. By the fourth day, I noticed more signs that someone had been nearby. When I came back from collecting wood, I found my tent zipper about a quarter of the way open. I always zip it shut, not halfway, not a little, all the way. I stared at it for a while. Nothing inside had been touched. My bag was where I left it, my gun was under my pillow, my food was still tied up in the trees. But I still didn't like it. That evening, I made a point to wipe the dirt around the tent smooth. I wanted to see if anyone stepped close while I slept. The next morning, sure enough, there were prints. Just two. One near the fire pit, one closer to the back of the tent. I looked at them for a long time. They were clear, wide-soled boots, maybe size 10 or 11. The tread looked deeper than my own. They weren't mine, that I knew for sure. I packed my gear quickly. I didn't eat breakfast. I figured I could make it halfway back to the truck before dark if I left early. But something pulled at me. Something about not wanting to rush, not wanting to act like I was afraid. I've always hated running from things. I decided I'd move camp closer to the old stream, further down the slope. I told myself it was to get water easier, but the truth was, I wanted a new spot, a new set of trees, maybe more cover, maybe to get away from whoever had walked up to my tent. The new site was lower, deeper in the woods, thicker trees, less wind. I kept the fire small and didn't sit out long. I ate quick, packed everything back up except the tent, and slept with my boots on and the gun in my hand. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up, not to sound, not to light, just that weight again, that sense of being watched. I didn't move at first. I just stared at the inside of the tent, heart thudding like a drum. Then I heard it, a slow scrape, something brushing against the side of the tent. Not hard, just soft, like fingers. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited, holding the gun in both hands, pointed at the entrance. The sound didn't come again, just wind, soft through the trees. By morning, the brush near the tent looked pressed down, like someone had crouched there. No boot prints this time, just broken twigs and a weird smell in the air. Sweat, old clothes, something that didn't belong out there. That was it. I was done. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I just took my pack and started hiking. The trail down wasn't marked, but I remembered the tree lines, the split in the ridge where the rock juts out like a blade, the fallen tree that points east. I moved fast, sweating through my shirt before the sun even got high. Halfway down, I heard branches snapping behind me. I froze, waited, nothing. I moved again, slower, more cracks, maybe 30 yards back. Then silence. I started walking faster, then jogging. I didn't care about twisting my ankle or falling anymore. I just wanted to reach the truck. I got there just after noon. The truck was untouched. No signs of damage, no prints around it. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat for a while, hands shaking. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? That someone touched my tent and left prints? That I felt watched? No one was hurt. Nothing was stolen. But something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Back home, I tried to let it go. I cleaned the gear, put everything back in storage, went back to work. But it stuck in my head like a splinter under the skin. I couldn't sleep without thinking about that scrape on the tent wall, or those 2 prints by the fire. A week later, I checked the trail reports online. I wanted to see if anyone else had logged anything strange. No reports, no recent visitors. Then I dug deeper, local news stories, small reports, and I found something. A short article from a year earlier. A missing man, hiker, last seen near Franklin in the woods. They found his camp torn apart. His gear was scattered. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no body. Just gone. Another article, 2 hunters reported someone watching them from a ridge. Tall man, dirty clothes, never said a word. Disappeared when they called out. They called him the Ridge Man in the comments. No official nickname, just something folks said online. Some thought it was a hermit. Others said it was just local kids messing with people. I don't know what I believe. I just know I won't ever camp alone again. Not there. Not anywhere that deep. Not where the trees feel like they're watching you. Not where someone might be living out there, alone, waiting for people to step too far off the path. I still dream about that night sometimes. The scrape on the tent wall, the smell, the prints. Not a monster, not a ghost, just someone real, someone close. And I think that's what scared me the most. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. It was October of 2019, and I had just gone through a rough patch. My job at the auto parts warehouse in Tacoma had burned me out, and my girlfriend of 4 years had moved out a few months earlier. The lease on our apartment was almost up. I had some savings built up, and I figured I could afford a few weeks off to reset and clear my head before figuring out the next step. I'd always enjoyed being out in the woods. Something about the quiet and the way the air smelled, like moss and earth and old pine, helped me breathe easier. So I packed up my old Ford Ranger with a canvas tent, some gear, a sleeping bag, a Jetboil stove, 2 weeks of food, and a weather radio. I also brought my Ruger .22 rifle, more out of habit than real fear, since I wasn't planning on hunting or anything. I didn't even plan to stay near other people. I wanted to be alone. I didn't pick a campsite from a guidebook. Instead, I used a mix of paper maps and Google Earth before I left to find a patch of forest that looked remote enough without being totally inaccessible. There was a service road just south of Lake Quinault that twisted its way up a ridge into the denser parts of the woods, and about 5 miles in, there was a flat clearing that looked big enough to pitch a tent. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was fine with me. I wasn't going out there for picnic tables and fire rings. The road was rough, just gravel and dirt, mostly washed out in parts. My truck barely made it through some of the turns without sliding, but I took it slow. When I finally got to the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The place was perfect, silent except for the wind in the branches. No signs of people anywhere. I set up camp in the center of the clearing. I didn't bother with a campfire since the ground was damp, and I figured I'd just eat dehydrated meals with the stove. The first 2 days were calm. It drizzled off and on, and the trees kept most of the rain off. I spent my time hiking out in different directions during the day, always careful to mark my trail with orange ribbon and check my compass. I saw a couple of deer and even a black bear at a distance, but nothing too close. At night, I listened to the rain tap against the nylon walls of the tent and felt more peace than I'd felt in months. I didn't see a single person the whole time, but the third night was different. That afternoon, the weather shifted. The wind picked up. The sky had a low, leaden look to it, thicker clouds rolling in, darker than before. The air smelled sharp like metal. I heard no birds. That usually meant a real storm was coming. So I packed all my gear into sealed dry sacks and tightened down the rainfly on the tent. I even dug a shallow trench around the base of it with my camp shovel to keep water from running underneath. The rain started heavy around dusk. It wasn't a sprinkle anymore. It was full-on sheets of rain pouring down in the trees. It hit the tent hard and constant, like handfuls of pebbles. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped everything tight, and lay there listening. The ground below me stayed dry thanks to the tarp I'd laid underneath, but the wind was strong enough to make the sides of the tent ripple. Somewhere around 10 or 11 that night, I heard something that cut through the sound of the storm. A thud, not a branch falling. I know what that sounds like, random snapping, followed by a thump. This was dull, solid, like someone had dropped something heavy into the mud just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. The rain hadn't let up, and the wind was still moving the trees, but I could swear I heard footsteps in the muck. Slow, wet, like boots pulling free from the ground. I didn't move. I just stared at the dark fabric above me. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I didn't even breathe loud. My rifle was propped up against the inside corner of the tent, just within reach. My hand crept toward it. I stayed still for a long time, maybe half an hour. Eventually, I told myself it had to be a deer or something, maybe a bear rooting around. I didn't keep food outside the bear bag, so I figured nothing should attract them. Still, I kept the rifle next to me and didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When morning came, the rain was still falling but lighter. I crawled out of the tent and looked around. There were footprints, not animal tracks, real human boot prints, in the mud just a few feet from my tent entrance. Deep impressions, big, probably men's size 11s or 12s. The pattern on the sole looked like those cheap department store work boots. They weren't mine. I checked against the tread on my own boots. These were different. The prints came in from the north tree line and stopped about 10 feet from the tent, turned around, and went back the same way. No sign of anything else. No trash, no broken branches. Just the prints. I stood there a long time just staring. Felt wrong. Someone had come out into the woods in the middle of a thunderstorm, walked up to my tent, then left. Didn't call out, didn't light a flashlight, just stood there, watched. I don't know. That's what it felt like. I packed everything up fast, stuffed the wet tent into a bin, didn't even try to fold it right. My plan was to hike out to the truck, get back to the highway, and go home. I didn't make it that far. About 2 miles down the service road, I found a tree fallen across the path. It had come down during the night, wide enough and heavy enough that there was no way I was moving it on my own. I got out of the truck, stood in the rain, and stared at it, cursing under my breath. I wasn't even sure I could turn the Ranger around on the narrow stretch of road I was on, but I didn't want to stay out there. I definitely didn't want to sleep another night in that spot. So I did a 10-point turn, almost slid the rear end off the embankment once, and barely got the truck turned around. I figured I'd backtrack and try another path, maybe a forest road that looped around east. That's when I noticed it. Another set of boot prints, right near where I had gotten out of the truck. Fresh, less than an hour old, judging by the way the rain hadn't totally filled them in yet. They came from the woods and disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. Same tread pattern as before. I didn't say anything out loud. I just got back in the truck, locked the doors, and drove. I kept my eyes on the rear view the whole time. It was hard to explain, but I felt watched. Not just like something could be nearby, but like someone was waiting, maybe just off the road, watching me move. I found a wider turnout and pulled off to check my maps. There was a trail that curved east and eventually met up with another service road, but it would take hours to get through. It was almost noon by then, and I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark. Still, I wasn't going to turn around. I started hiking the trail on foot first to see if the truck could handle it. It was overgrown in places but manageable. No signs of recent traffic, no tire tracks, no boot prints. That made me feel a little better. I got the truck through the first part fine. I had to stop a few times to move rocks and branches. The rain picked up again just before sunset. The trail widened into a dry patch beneath a rock overhang, and I decided to camp there. It was elevated and better protected from the wind. I didn't bother with the tent. I just spread my sleeping bag in the truck bed, under the canopy, and kept the rifle loaded next to me. I didn't eat, didn't even take off my boots. I just laid there, eyes open, listening. Around midnight, I heard the same sound again. Thud. This time it was closer, and not from the ground. It sounded like a hand slapping against the side of the truck. I froze. I didn't breathe. The rain had muffled everything, but I was sure I heard it again. Just one solid thunk on the metal panel near the tailgate. I waited, hand gripping the rifle tight. Then the truck rocked. Just once. Not like the wind pushed it. More like something had leaned or pressed against it. Hard. I didn't get out. I didn't move. I waited for hours, eyes locked on the back window of the canopy, watching for any shape, any shadow. Nothing else happened that night. By dawn, it was quiet again. When I finally stepped out, everything was still wet and gray, but there were no prints this time. No marks. Nothing I could prove. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I didn't stop moving after that. I drove straight until I hit the next road. Didn't even pause to eat. I got out of the forest by mid-afternoon and pulled into a gas station on Route 101. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would I tell? The cops? I didn't have a name, didn't see a face. All I had was a gut feeling and a couple of boot prints. Nothing illegal about hiking near someone's camp, technically. But I knew what I felt. Someone had followed me, watched me. They hadn't tried to rob me. They didn't shout or ask for help. They didn't take anything. They just came and stood there in the dark, in the rain, waiting for something. I went home, washed all the gear, and packed it away in the basement. I didn't camp again for over a year. Even now, when I do go, I don't go alone. And I don't stray off the marked trails anymore. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. The scariest thing out in the woods isn't bears or mountain lions. It's people. People with no reason to be where they are. People who don't want anything from you, except maybe to scare you. Or worse, I never found out who it was or what they wanted. And that's what still keeps me up some nights. It was early October 2021. I was 29 and working remotely from my apartment in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd been spending way too much time indoors, so I planned a solo camping trip to clear my head. I picked a spot about 3 hours northeast, near a lake I'd never visited before, Blue Ridge Reservoir. I figured since it was a weekday, it wouldn't be busy. I didn't want company, just a few days of quiet, nature, and no one talking to me. I needed that. I packed my gear on a Tuesday morning. My old black Jeep Cherokee was already half loaded from past trips. Tent, sleeping pad, propane stove, folding chair, and the rest. I grabbed a couple gallons of water, some Mountain House meals, peanut butter, trail mix, and a 6-pack of beer for the cooler. My .22 rifle came with me too. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I always took it on solo trips, mostly for peace of mind. It took me just over 3 hours to reach the general area, bouncing down a washboard forest road that rattled everything inside the Jeep. Eventually, I found a spot about a quarter-mile off the road, hidden enough by trees that nobody would see my tent unless they walked right up to it. I liked it that way. The trees there were mostly tall pines, with some brushy undergrowth around the edges. The lake was down a slope, maybe 5 minutes from where I parked. There weren't any other cars or people around, at least not that I saw. I set up my tent on a patch of dry pine needles, got my little cook table unfolded, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. By the time I finished, the shadows were already long. The air smelled like cold sap and dry dirt. That first night was uneventful. I heated up some chili, ate it while sitting on my camp chair, and then read a paperback for a while using my headlamp. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it all the way up, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Coyotes howled once or twice in the distance, but that was it. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I walked down to the lake with my coffee. It was smooth as glass, completely still, with a light fog hovering right above the surface. I sat on a flat rock for maybe an hour, watching the sun push through the pines. I didn't see or hear a single boat, person, or even an airplane the entire time. That second day, I hiked around for a while, staying within about 2 miles of my camp. I came across a small dry creek bed that looked like it might carry water during the spring runoff. It curved around the base of a steep hill, with a lot of rocks and dead branches piled up. There were some old boot prints in the dirt, probably from months ago. Some looked small, almost like a kid's, but I didn't think too much of it. People brought their kids camping out here all the time. I made a mental note of the spot in case I needed to gather firewood or just explore more later. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I cracked a beer and boiled water for one of those freeze-dried meals, beef stroganoff, I think. It was colder that night. I built a small fire in a rock ring I'd put together earlier and sat close to it as the light drained from the forest. I could hear small things moving in the underbrush, probably squirrels or rabbits. The woods always came alive right at dusk. Just before I turned in for the night, I thought I heard a stick break from somewhere out in the trees. Not close, but not far either. I froze for a second, holding my breath. It was nothing at first. Then I heard another crunch. Could have been a deer, maybe even a bear, though I didn't see any scat or signs around. I held on to my flashlight and rifle a little tighter that night. I kept both right next to me in the tent. The third day was when things started to feel strange. I woke up just after 6 a.m., cold and stiff, but nothing out of place in camp. I boiled coffee and made some instant oatmeal. Then I walked the same loop around the area as before. When I passed that creek bed again, I noticed something new. There was a footprint in the soft dirt near the edge of the slope, a fresh one. It was definitely not mine. Too large, too deep. My boots were a size 10, and this one looked at least a size or two bigger. And it wasn't one of those heavy tread hiking boots either. It was flat-soled, maybe a work boot or something similar. I bent down and looked closer. It hadn't been rained on or dried up. It had to have been made within the last few hours. That meant someone else was out here. I stood there for a while, trying to hear something. The forest was dead quiet. Not even birds. That silence didn't sit right with me. I headed back to camp, taking a longer way through the trees just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I saw nothing. Still, my gut told me to be more alert. I loaded the rifle that afternoon and kept it within arm's reach the rest of the day. Nothing else happened until after dark. I was in my sleeping bag, reading with my headlamp on low, when I heard what sounded like metal hitting metal outside the tent. A light clink like a pan being bumped. I froze. Every hair on my arms stood up. My mess kit was inside my Jeep, but the little propane burner had been left out on the table. I turned off my light and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to look through the mesh. The woods were pitch black, but the moon was out, and I could make out the shapes of the trees and my table about 20 feet away. Nothing moved. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it again, a faint scrape, I swung the tent flap open all the way and scanned the site with my flashlight. Nobody, nothing, but my burner had been moved. It was on its side now, not how I left it. I walked over slowly, scanning everything. I didn't see any footprints or signs of an animal. The forest was dead silent again. That bothered me more than anything else. I went back into the tent, didn't sleep much, and kept my rifle right on my chest the whole night. The next morning, I decided I was going to cut the trip short. I didn't like the feeling out there anymore. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. I boiled coffee fast and skipped breakfast. Just as I was packing up the tent, I noticed something else. There was a small strip of white cloth tied around a branch about 30 feet from my sight. It hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been torn off a t-shirt or maybe a sheet. It was knotted once and just dangling. That was enough for me. I loaded the Jeep as fast as I could. My heart was racing the whole time. Felt like someone was watching me. I kept scanning the woods, expecting to see a person standing out there. But there was nothing. I put the last of my gear in and slammed the hatch shut. When I got into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine wouldn't turn over. I froze. I tried again. Nothing. Just a click. I popped the hood and ran around front. My battery cables were intact. Everything looked normal. I checked the battery terminals. Someone had loosened the positive cable, just enough that the connection wouldn't hold. It didn't come loose on its own. I always check that stuff before a trip. My hands were shaking as I tightened it back with a multi-tool. Once it was snug, I tried the engine again. It roared to life like normal. I drove out fast, bouncing hard over the road, the suspension groaning the whole way. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I looked in the rearview mirror one last time before turning onto the pavement, I thought I saw something or someone step behind a tree far down the road. I never went back to Blue Ridge Reservoir. I never reported it. What could I say? No one actually did anything to me. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was taken. But someone had been watching me. Someone followed me out there. They stayed quiet, moved things around, marked the woods, tried to make sure I couldn't leave. I don't know what they wanted. I don't want to know. Now, when I camp, I don't go alone anymore. I don't stray far from where other people are. And I always check my gear twice, especially the engine. People think the scariest things in the woods are animals or ghosts. But that's not true. The scariest thing in the forest is another person you didn't know was there. And I know because one time I wasn't alone. Not really. Back in the fall of 2013, I was 29 and going through one of those restless phases people don't really talk about much. I had quit my job at a local mechanic shop in Charleston, West Virginia, after 6 years, not because I hated it or anything, but because I couldn't stand the feeling that every day was going to be the same until I died. My long-term girlfriend and I had split up earlier that summer, and most of my friends were either married or had kids, so I found myself drifting. I needed to get out and feel something again. I'd always liked camping, especially alone. It was one of the few things that cleared my head. I figured a few nights out in the hills might reset me. I heard about a place from this guy I used to work with, Graveyard Ridge. It wasn't an actual graveyard, not officially, but people said it got the name because there was an old Civil War burial spot somewhere up there. No headstones, just mounds covered over by trees and time. Nobody had been buried up there in over a century, but folks avoided it just the same. It sat about 2 hours south of Charleston, near a town called Glen Fork. He said his uncle used to hunt deer up that way and mentioned it was remote enough that you could go a whole weekend without seeing another soul. That's what I was looking for. Silence, seclusion, space to let my brain breathe. I loaded up my gear in my old Toyota Tacoma, tossed in a couple days worth of food, water, my old tent, and a .22 rifle I kept more out of habit than need. I set off early on a Friday morning, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. It was cool and gray, just the kind of weather I liked for hiking. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, it was around noon. I parked at the end of a dirt access road near an old gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. From there, it was a couple miles hike to the top. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a printed topo map and my GPS, and the guy at work had roughly drawn a route that would take me along the ridge where the supposed burial mounds were. The air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves, and the forest was quiet aside from the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush, probably squirrels or raccoons. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Something about the silence didn't sit right with me. It was a little too quiet. After a good 90 minutes of hiking, I reached a flat area near the top of the ridge. It opened into a clearing maybe 50 feet wide, surrounded on 3 sides by dense woods. The 4th side dropped off into a steep ravine. That's where I decided to make camp. The spot had a natural windbreak, soft pine needles covering the ground, and a perfect view out toward the valley. I figured if this was Graveyard Ridge, it wasn't a bad final resting place. I set up my tent near a cluster of large rocks, then gathered firewood from the surrounding area. While doing that, I noticed a few strange mounds, evenly spaced, maybe 10 feet apart, covered in moss and leaves. They were subtle, nothing dramatic, but something about how they lined up caught my eye. They didn't look natural. I told myself it was just the way water had flowed over time, or maybe roots shifting underneath. By sundown, I had a small fire going. I ate some instant noodles and jerky, then sat staring into the flames as darkness crept in. The sky clouded over, and the stars disappeared. A light wind came through the trees, bringing with it a sudden drop in temperature. I layered up, tossed a few more sticks on the fire, and leaned back against my pack. Then I heard it, a soft, slow thud. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere off in the woods, maybe 50 yards out. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Nothing, just the wind again. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, but no other sound came. I told myself it could have been a branch falling or even a deer stepping on something. But still, I slept with the .22 next to me in the tent that night, and I kept waking up every hour, checking my watch, listening. Around 3 a.m., I had finally drifted off into something close to real sleep when I heard the same sound again. This time it was louder and closer. Thud, not like footsteps, not quite. It was heavier, like something being dragged and then dropped. I sat up slowly in the tent and turned off my sleeping bag zipper as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, but there were still glowing embers. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. I didn't see anything at first, just the trees swaying a little and the edge of the clearing bathed in gray moonlight. Then I saw something, just past the fire, maybe 30 feet from the tent. There was a dark shape. It wasn't moving. It looked like a person hunched down near one of the mounds. My stomach sank. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The shape didn't do anything for what felt like minutes. I blinked a few times, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I turned the flashlight on and pointed it in that direction. Nothing, just leaves and rocks. The shape was gone. I stepped outside the tent with the rifle, heart hammering in my chest, and slowly walked over to where I thought I saw it. I found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anyone had been there. The woods were still. The only sound was the crackle of a few dying coals in the fire. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up by the fire with the rifle across my lap, ears straining to hear every creak and whisper of the woods around me. At dawn, I packed up and hiked out, but something stopped me about halfway back to the truck. Along the trail, maybe a quarter mile from where I'd camped, I found what looked like a fresh scrape on a tree about shoulder height. It was wide, maybe 3 inches across, and the bark had been peeled clean off in a vertical line. Below it, I saw scuff marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged. The trail veered slightly downhill there, and whatever it was had disturbed the leaves and left a faint trail into the brush. I followed it, just for a bit. About 50 feet off the main path, I found a shallow depression in the ground. Not a hole, not really, but a place where the dirt had been recently turned. There was a torn piece of faded fabric caught on a branch nearby. Looked like it had once been part of a jacket. I stood there for a while, staring, and then slowly backed away. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back to town. What would I say? That I saw a shape in the dark and some scuffed dirt in the woods? That I camped on top of old graves and maybe wasn't alone? People would laugh or think I was trying to be spooky. I looked up missing persons reports from the county that week, but didn't find anything that matched what I'd seen. But here's the part that stuck with me the most. A week later, I took my truck in to get the tires rotated at the same shop I used to work at. One of the younger guys there was telling me about some trouble they'd had up by Glen Fork. Someone breaking into hunting cabins, stealing canned food and supplies, leaving weird scratch marks on doors. The sheriff thought it might be a drifter living rough in the woods. They hadn't caught anyone, though. It made my blood go cold. I didn't go camping alone for a long time after that. Even now, 12 years later, I think about that night sometimes. About the shape near the fire. About the sound. The fabric caught in the branch. The scuff marks. I don't know who or what I was near that night, but I know I wasn't alone on Graveyard Ridge. And I know that whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was living there, watching, waiting, and it didn't want me there. So I left, and I never went back, and I never will. It was October 2021 when I drove out to the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado to do some elk hunting. I had just turned 33, and that year had been rough. My job was draining, my relationship had ended a few months earlier, and I needed a break from everything. I've hunted all my life. My dad got me into it as a kid in Minnesota. Since moving to Colorado 6 years ago, I'd done a few solo backcountry trips, but this time I wanted to go further and stay out longer. The plan was to camp out in the wilderness for 5 or 6 days, maybe a week if the weather held up. I'd picked a spot about 20 miles west of Lake City, tucked between some dense forest and rugged ridges. It wasn't a marked trailhead or anything, just some overgrown Forest Service road that led into miles of timber and steep terrain. I'd studied maps for weeks beforehand and marked out a few game trails, water sources, and some clearings where elk were likely to graze. It seemed like a perfect place. Quiet, remote, and tough to reach. I had all my gear ready. Rifle, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried meals, enough water filters to last me a month if needed. I had a Garmin GPS with emergency SOS, but I rarely checked it unless I had to. I liked the quiet, liked being disconnected. The drive out from Montrose took about 2.5 hours. I got to the dirt road in the early afternoon, locked my truck behind a patch of trees, and started hiking in with a 60-pound pack on my back. By dusk, I'd covered about 6 miles on foot and reached the first ridge I had planned to camp near. I pitched my tent in a small clearing under some spruce trees. There was a little stream about 200 yards downhill, which made it a good spot. I set up camp, boiled some water, and ate a Mountain House chili mac under the stars. The first night was cold but peaceful. I didn't hear much except for the wind rustling the treetops and a few distant owl calls. I slept well and woke before dawn. That first day, I didn't see any elk, but I spotted plenty of signs. Tracks, fresh scat, rubbed up trees. I glassed a couple of high meadows and marked a few spots to return to the next day. The terrain was rough, lots of downed trees and steep inclines, but I liked that. Kept most people out. On the second night, something woke me up. It was just past 1 a.m. I had my watch clipped inside the tent. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A branch cracking maybe, or a rustle in the brush. I sat up and unzipped the tent slightly to listen. Nothing, just wind. I laid back down, pulled the sleeping bag over my shoulders, and eventually drifted off again. Day 3, I hiked to a basin about 2 miles southwest from my camp. It was hard going. A lot of climbing, thick underbrush, but the views were beautiful. Around noon, I spotted my first elk, 3 cows and a bull in the distance across a ridge, too far for a clean shot. I watched them through my scope until they disappeared into the timber. I spent the rest of that afternoon tracking them, but I lost the trail in some rocky terrain. Still, I was encouraged. They were here and I had time. I made it back to camp around 5 p.m., sore and tired. That night, I boiled up some more food, logged the day in my small notebook, and crawled into the tent as the temperature dropped fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up that night, but I woke up fast, like something jolted me from sleep. It was dead quiet. No wind, no owls, nothing. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it, slow crunching. Not a twig snapping, but steady footsteps. I held my breath. My rifle was beside me in the tent, always loaded when I was out alone. I reached for it quietly and stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. Whoever or whatever it was didn't move for what felt like forever. Then I heard the faintest shuffle, like someone adjusting their weight. I clicked off the safety. My heart was pounding. After about a minute, the sound moved off, crunching leaves, fading slowly. I waited another half hour before I dared unzip the tent. Nothing was there. No light, no movement, just that oppressive silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept my rifle close and my boots on inside the bag. At dawn, I stepped outside and looked for tracks. There were a few marks in the dirt and pine needles near the edge of camp. Could have been boot prints, could have been a bear, but they were too indistinct to tell. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. Something had walked right up to my tent and stood there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a curious deer, maybe a black bear sniffing around. But I'd camped too many nights in too many wild places to know that wasn't how animals behaved. They skitter off, they don't linger like that. I debated packing up and heading back, but the weather was still good, and I hadn't gotten a shot yet. I moved camp that day, about a mile east along a higher ridgeline. It was more exposed, but gave me better visibility and a better shot at tracking elk through the valley below. I spent the whole next day hunting and didn't see a thing, not even fresh sign. It felt like the woods had emptied out overnight. That evening, I was walking back toward camp when I saw something in the distance. A thin column of smoke rising straight up from the trees across the basin. Not mine. I knew where I'd camped, and this was maybe a mile south of that. The smoke was faint, and the wind was calm. Someone else was out here, but I hadn't seen another soul in 4 days. No tire tracks, no camps, nothing. Still, it wasn't impossible. Maybe another hunter. Maybe someone else had bushwhacked in. Back at camp, I made dinner and kept glancing in that direction. I couldn't see the smoke anymore, just dark trees and the early pink of sunset behind them. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement again. Not as close this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone out there. Like someone was circling my camp at a distance, just out of sight. On the 5th day, I went down toward where I'd seen the smoke. There was no trail, just thick timber and underbrush. I spent nearly 4 hours bushwhacking toward the area, but I didn't find any sign of a fire or another camp. No ash, no footprints, no disturbed ground. I started heading back. That's when I realized I was being followed. It wasn't just paranoia. Every time I stopped, I heard something stop too. Every time I moved, I heard distant movement, sticks snapping, faint rustling. like someone trying to stay just far enough back. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I just kept a steady pace and took the long way back to camp. I stayed alert, rifle in hand, eyes constantly scanning the trees. That night, I built a fire and stayed up until nearly 3 a.m. No movement, no noise, just the occasional crackle of flame and the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't even get in the tent. I sat with my back to a tree, blanket around my shoulders, rifle across my knees. I was done hunting. I was ready to leave at first light. I broke down camp as soon as the sun was up and packed my gear fast. The hike out was brutal. My legs were shot, and the extra adrenaline had left me shaky. I took a more direct route than the one I'd come in on, bushwhacking across a ridge that cut 2 miles off the trip. It was steep, full of loose rocks and thick trees, but I wanted to be out. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the road where I'd parked. My truck was still there, untouched, but something had changed. On the back window, someone had drawn a large X with what looked like ash or dirt. Just one big crude X across the glass. My hands went cold. I looked around the trees, no movement, no sound. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I got to Montrose. I told a ranger at the local BLM office what I saw. He took notes but said unless there was a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I filed a report just in case. I showed him a picture of the mark on the truck window. He just frowned and said it was probably some messed up prank. But I know what I felt out there. I know someone was following me, watching me. That wasn't just some hunter or camper. I've been doing this a long time, and I've never felt anything like that in the woods before. It wasn't supernatural, nothing like that. Just a person. Some sick, quiet person who knew the area better than I did and wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. I haven't gone back to that part of Colorado since. I still hunt, but not alone. Not anymore. It was early October 2021 when I decided to take some time off work. I was 34 back then, single, and working remotely as a freelance systems technician out of Pittsburgh. I needed to get away from screens for a while. Things had been piling up, mental clutter mostly. Nothing dramatic. I just needed silence, fresh air, and maybe a few cold nights in the woods. I hadn't done any solo camping in a while, and the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania was always my go-to. It was close enough to home, but remote enough that you could go a whole weekend without hearing another person's voice. And that's what I wanted. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, my knife, bear spray, a few MREs, 2 jugs of water, a water filter, a couple granola bars, a small cook set, flashlight, headlamp, power bank, and my Ruger .22 I kept mostly for peace of mind. I wasn't expecting any problems. I knew the woods. I knew how to camp alone. I'd done it plenty of times. And I'd even been to this exact area before, back in 2016 with an old friend of mine who'd moved out of state. The area was south of Kellettville, tucked off a barely used service road that peeled away from Route 66 and wound through a mix of dense pine and hardwoods. The spot wasn't on any official maps, but it was flat, near a shallow creek, and had a soft bed of pine needles covering the forest floor. That part of the forest had a thick, overgrown feeling to it, like everything was just a little too untouched, the kind of place that felt forgotten. I arrived around 3:45 p.m. after a 3-hour drive. The last couple miles of road were rough, more like a memory of a road than anything paved, but I made it fine. Parked the truck near a stand of old birch, slung on my pack, and hiked in about 20 minutes until I reached the spot. Same clearing as before. The creek still ran a few dozen feet off to the west. Same big moss-covered rocks, same logs, same feeling of isolation. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up easy. I gathered some dead branches and small logs from nearby and made a modest fire pit, though fire restrictions were in place, so I knew I wouldn't light anything until after sundown, and even then, I'd keep it small. I boiled some water on my little stove, ate one of the MREs, and watched the sun start dropping behind the hills. There was a kind of golden hush settling over the forest. That long, slow light of October that feels like it's stretching the last bit of warmth out of the year. I remember thinking, asterisk, this is what I needed, star. That first night passed quietly. I read a few chapters of a book on my phone, listened to the sounds of crickets and the distant rush of the creek. I heard a few coyotes somewhere off, miles away, nothing threatening. I slept light, as I always do on solo trips, but I wasn't bothered by anything. I even woke up once around 2 a.m. and poked my head out of the tent. The moonlight was so bright I didn't need a flashlight. Everything was still, cold, beautiful. The next morning, I hiked a few miles to the south with my day pack and came across some deer trails and what looked like old logging tracks. I found a rusted-out piece of farming equipment off in the brush, something ancient and half-buried. Might have been a thresher or plow. It reminded me how old these woods were and how many people had lived and worked out here generations ago. That part of Pennsylvania is full of that kind of forgotten history. Entire towns wiped off the map after the mills closed or the timber dried up. Now it's just ruins under vines. On the way back, maybe half a mile from my site, I passed by a part of the forest I didn't remember. Not exactly a trail, but a thin path worn into the earth. Probably a game trail, I thought. I looked down it and felt this brief chill, like a small thread of unease pulled tight across my chest. Not fear, just something that made my skin tighten. I kept walking. I chalked it up to being alone, my mind making shapes out of nothing. By the time I got back to my tent, the sun was already starting to dip again. I cooked up some oatmeal, cleaned up, and settled into another quiet evening. That's when the first thing happened. I was sitting on a log maybe 20 feet from my tent, eating. I just finished boiling water and was letting the oatmeal cool. The sun was down, but it wasn't pitch black yet. That blue-gray dusk was just giving way to darkness. That's when I heard something move in the brush behind me. It wasn't a deer. I know what deer sound like, sharp, stomping steps, then they usually bolt. This was slower, more deliberate. I froze and turned. My headlamp wasn't on yet. The fire wasn't lit. I couldn't see much, but I stared into the trees and listened. Whatever it was, it stopped moving. Dead quiet. No wind. Just me, my breath, and that awful sense that something had been watching me. I stood up slowly, walked to my tent, and grabbed my flashlight. Swung the beam into the woods in wide sweeps. Nothing, just trees and underbrush. I told myself it was a raccoon or porcupine, something small, but I noticed something else too. The normal nighttime sounds had stopped.
No insects. No frogs.
Just dead quiet. Eventually, the noise came back. A cricket here, a distant owl call. I forced myself to settle down. I lit a tiny fire and sat beside it until late. Slept with my bear spray and pistol within reach. That night, I woke up twice. Once at 1:30, again at 4 o'clock. Both times, it felt like something had disturbed the air outside the tent. No sound, no definite movement, but the kind of wakefulness that doesn't come from dreams. My body just knew. I didn't look out the second time. I just lay there, heart thudding, until the gray light of morning finally crept in. I should have left that morning. That's the part one keep coming back to. Everything in me told me it was time to go, but I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I planned for 3 nights, and it was only night 2. I didn't want to feel like I'd backed out over nothing.
Breathe.
That's all it was. Just dumb, stubborn pride. I spent the day near camp. Didn't wander far. I made sure everything was packed and ready, just in case. I even moved my tent closer to a rocky outcrop so I had more visibility. That evening, As I boiled water again and sat with my back to a boulder, I noticed something down by the creek. It looked like bark had been stripped from one of the trees. A long, vertical patch, almost as if someone had peeled it away. I hadn't seen that the day before. Could have missed it, but it caught my attention.
I walked over.
The bark looked fresh. Maybe it had been scraped by an animal. Maybe not. I looked closer. There were faint marks below it, like someone had dragged something through the dirt. Not deep, but not natural either. A weird pattern, almost like boot tread, only too narrow. That night, I barely slept. I heard noises again, closer this time. Something breathing maybe 20 feet from the tent. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there with my hand around the pistol grip, staring at the roof of the nylon and counting the seconds. Whatever it was, it stayed for a long time. I could feel it there. I don't know how else to explain it. Eventually, it left. I never heard it go. I only knew that, suddenly, I could breathe again. When the sun rose, I didn't waste time. I packed up fast and made my way back to the truck. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Nothing. But that didn't mean I was alone. When I got to the truck, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were drag marks near the tailgate. Not from me, not from gear. They came from the woods and stopped about 5 feet from the truck. Like something or someone had crouched there for a while. I checked everything. No sign of damage. No missing items. But the ground told its own story. I got in, locked the doors, and drove out fast, bumping over that rough old road, the branches scraping the sides of the truck. I didn't breathe easy until I was past the main highway and a good 20 miles out. I didn't tell anyone right away, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me. There wasn't anything supernatural or mysterious. It was all real, physical. Something was out there, or someone, but because I couldn't explain it clearly, it was just unease, danger without a face. I later read a report online about old poacher trails and illegal hunting cabins hidden deep in that section of the forest. Some had been abandoned decades ago, others maybe not. There were even stories of squatters or hermits living off-grid, some harmless, others not so much. Whatever was out there, I don't think it wanted to hurt me. Not exactly, but it didn't want me there, and it made sure I knew it. I haven't been back to Allegheny since. I still camp, but never alone, never that deep, and I never ignore my gut anymore. When the forest goes quiet like that, when something makes your skin crawl, it's not just imagination. Sometimes it means you're not as alone as you think. It was October of 2017, and I was living alone in a small rented place in Kalispell, Montana. I was 29 back then, working nights at a distribution center just off Highway 2. My hours were weird, and I didn't really socialize much. That Friday, I had 3 days off in a row and figured I'd make the most of it. I decided to head out for a solo camping trip near the Flathead National Forest, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy a few years earlier. It wasn't an official campground, more like a forgotten pull-off tucked off a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in ages. The first time I'd gone, it was quiet and untouched. No traffic, no people. That's exactly what I wanted again. I packed up Friday morning. Tent, tarp, a sleeping bag good to 20 degrees, 2 coolers, one with food, the other with beer and water, a flashlight, spare batteries, a folding chair, a hatchet, a loaded .357 I kept in the glove compartment, and my old army backpack filled with basic gear. I wasn't some survivalist nut, but I grew up hunting in Idaho and knew my way around the woods. I drove out past the town of Swan Lake, then onto a Forest Service road with no markings, just a faded metal gate left open. After bouncing along for 20 minutes, I pulled off onto a narrow track barely wide enough for my truck. At the end was a tiny clearing just big enough to turn around in. Beyond that was dense lodgepole pine and old growth. I set up there. It was already cool out, with those gray skies that don't seem to move. The wind had that sharp bite that only happens in Montana right before the snow really starts. I set up my tent facing the woods, not the road, and cleared a ring for a fire with my hatchet. I cracked a beer and sat back to enjoy the silence. No phone signal, no engine noise, just the occasional crow and the rustling of dry leaves. I didn't do much that evening. Started a fire, grilled 2 hot dogs, and drank a couple more beers. I didn't even bother exploring. I just sat in my camp chair, staring into the flames, thinking about how badly I needed a break from fluorescent lights and forklifts. When the fire burned low, I doused it properly with water from a jug and climbed into my sleeping bag with my headlamp clipped to the top of the tent. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to piss. I slid on my boots and stepped out into the cold. The sky had cleared up some. A half moon was just barely visible behind clouds. The woods looked silver and still. I walked 10 feet from the tent, did my business, and stood there listening. I always listen for a minute or two, call it a habit from hunting, just a way to stay aware of what's moving around you. That's when I noticed something. Not a noise, not exactly. More like the lack of one. Usually there's something. A breeze, a tree creaking, a distant bird. But this was still, completely still. Even the wind had stopped. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the moment I noticed it, I felt it in my chest. My body locked up like it was waiting for something to happen. I went back in the tent and zipped it shut tight. Laid there for a while in the dark, my headlamp turned off, just listening. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I drifted off. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight was pushing through the trees, and the air smelled like pine needles and wet dirt. I made instant coffee and some oatmeal, then hiked around a bit behind the site. The woods were deep and layered. Moss, branches, fallen logs, and no sign of people. No tire tracks or wrappers.
No boot prints.
That's how I liked it. Around noon, I came back to camp to find something strange. My cooler, just the one with the food, was open. The lid was sitting upside down next to it. I hadn't touched it that morning. Inside, one of the vacuum pack steaks I brought was missing. The rest of the food, eggs, a stick of butter, 2 apples, was still there.
No claw marks, no tearing.
It wasn't ripped open like a bear or raccoon got into it. It looked opened, like a person had taken the lid off and grabbed just one thing. That set me on edge. I checked the ground around it. The forest floor was soft but dry. If someone had come through, there should have been a mark. But I didn't see anything clear. I did a sweep around the whole site. Nothing.
No prints.
No broken branches. Nothing stolen but that one steak. I started to wonder if I'd just misremembered. Maybe I'd eaten it already, or maybe it had fallen out. But the cooler had been latched when I packed it. And even if it had come loose, why just one steak? Why not the butter or the eggs? I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was a fox or something small that managed to get lucky. Still, I kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That night was colder. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown, and I made a fire early just to stay warm. I didn't drink that night, just sat by the fire with my coat zipped to my throat and my boots resting on a rock close to the flames. I kept glancing out at the woods. It was that same weird silence again. It wasn't completely soundless, but close. Just the occasional wind rustling dead leaves. I felt watched. That's the only way I can put it. Not from one direction either. Just that sense of being seen, even though no one's around. The fire cracked behind me, and I turned to it quick, thinking something had stepped near the ring. But it was just a stick collapsing in the flames. I stayed out longer than I should have. I didn't want to go into the tent. It felt safer outside where I could see in every direction. But I knew I had to sleep. I checked the area one last time with my flashlight, looked at every tree trunk, every shadow, then zipped myself inside and laid down with the .357 beside my pillow. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. Only this time, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I didn't have to piss. I wasn't cold. I just opened my eyes and felt something. I laid still, ears straining, my heart already going faster than it should have been. I was on my side, staring at the wall of the tent. I could see the faint light of the moon casting outlines of branches on the fabric. But as I watched, I saw something else. A shadow. Not a branch, not some blowing leaf. It was a figure. It stood perfectly still just outside the tent. I didn't move, not an inch. I just watched it through the thin fabric, trying to make sense of it. It was a shape, upright, maybe 6 feet tall. Shoulders, neck, head. I couldn't see details, just the mass of it. It didn't sway, didn't shift. It was completely still. Then, slowly, it bent at the waist, like it was crouching. Then I heard it, breathing. It was subtle, shallow, through the fabric. But I know what I heard. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It was human. Slow inhales, tight exhales. It was listening, or smelling. I stayed frozen for what felt like a full hour. I didn't blink. I didn't twitch. My hand hovered inches from the pistol, but I didn't touch it. I was afraid that any sound would make it react. Eventually, the shadow stood up straight again, and then it walked off.
No rush, no sprint.
Just a slow walk back into the trees. I waited another hour after that, then another. Finally, when the faintest light started to rise through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. There were no footprints, just disturbed leaves in a few places where the weight had shifted the top layer. Not deep enough to track. I broke down camp in less than 10 minutes. Everything got thrown into the back of the truck. I didn't eat, didn't even brush my teeth. I just got the hell out of there. I drove straight to the next gas station, which was nearly an hour away. I sat there in the lot for a while, just breathing, trying to decide what the hell had happened. Was it a hiker? A local messing around? Somebody living in the woods? But the way it stood there, crouched, quiet, that wasn't normal. People don't do that. Not out in the woods where no one's around. Not silently watching a tent without making their presence known. Not standing still for that long. Over the next few weeks, I thought a lot about it. I searched online for similar stories. That's when I first heard the word skinwalker. A native friend I used to work with once mentioned it in a story, but I'd brushed it off at the time. Online, I read about people seeing things in the woods that looked human but weren't quite right. Hearing voices that mimicked people they knew. Strange behavior. Silence. Watching. I don't believe in monsters. I really don't. But I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. There was no ghost.
No howl.
No glowing eyes. But something out there. Stood just outside my tent in the middle of the night, watched me sleep, and walked away like it had done it 100 times before. I've never camped alone again, and I don't go near Flathead anymore. I was 29 years old when I decided to take some time off from work and head out into the countryside for a solo camping trip. It was early October of 2018. The weather was still holding on to the tail end of summer, but you could feel the edge of autumn in the air. Mornings were crisp, evenings cooler, and the leaves were just starting to change. I lived in Bristol at the time, and I worked as a freelance graphic designer, so my schedule was flexible enough that I could get away during the week when campsites and trails were less crowded. I didn't want to go too far from civilization, just far enough to feel alone, so I picked a place in the Cotswolds, near a small village called Shipton-under-Wickwood. It was a quiet area I'd heard of from a friend, full of green rolling hills, dense woods, and footpaths that weren't too popular. I figured it'd be the right kind of peaceful. I packed up my gear in my old Volkswagen Golf: tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few changes of clothes, basic food, water, and some odds and ends. Nothing fancy. I wasn't doing bushcraft or trying to test my survival skills. Just needed to clear my head and enjoy the outdoors a bit. I got to the spot I'd chosen late in the afternoon, a flat clearing nestled in a small patch of woodland, about a 20-minute walk from where I'd parked the car. The path leading in wasn't well trodden, but I'd found it easily enough using the OS Map app on my phone. I pitched the tent just before the sun began to dip behind the trees. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Birds chirped every now and then, and there was the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted about. It was peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I heated up a tin of beans on my little gas stove, ate by the dim orange light of my headlamp, and then crawled into my sleeping bag to read a bit before sleeping. No phone signal out there, which I expected, so I had downloaded a few books beforehand. I remember hearing an owl not long after I turned the light off. It was the last thing I remember before falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6, to the sound of rain lightly tapping against the tent fabric. It was soft, barely more than a mist, but it gave the woods this pale gray atmosphere. Everything looked softer and stiller than the night before. I made coffee, ate a cold cereal bar, and decided to explore some of the trails nearby. I left most of my gear behind in the tent, just took a day pack with snacks, water, and a light jacket. I walked for hours. The area was beautiful, fields lined with dry stone walls, overgrown paths cutting through thickets of brambles, and quiet, shadowy woods where you couldn't hear much but your own breathing and the occasional bird overhead. It wasn't until I'd been out for maybe 3 or 4 hours that I saw someone for the first time. He was standing at the edge of the woods about 50 or 60 feet away from me, partially behind a tree. I didn't even notice him at first. It was just one of those moments where your brain suddenly registers that something is off, like something's watching you. I stopped walking and turned, and that's when I saw him. He was still not moving at all, almost blending in with the bark. He wore a long, dark brown coat that looked heavy and too warm for the weather. His face was pale, long, expressionless. His eyes looked wide from that distance. I couldn't make out much else, but the stillness of him, the way he stood without shifting even slightly, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure what to do, but after maybe 15 seconds of us just staring at each other, I turned and started walking back the way I came. I didn't run, didn't want to show panic, but every step away from him felt slower than it should have been. I didn't look back until I was well around a bend in the trail, and when I did, there was no one there. I told myself it was just some local out walking, maybe a bit eccentric, maybe just curious, but there was something about the way he stood, like he'd been waiting. I got back to camp and decided I'd stay one more night. I'd already paid to park, and nothing had happened, really. It was just a weird moment. I was probably reading too much into it. That's what I told myself. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every little sound. I heard branches snap sometime around midnight. Not loud, just a quick snap, then silence. I stayed still in my bag, eyes wide open, breathing as quietly as I could. Then nothing, just wind, the kind of cold that seeps in through the floor of your tent. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. The next day, I told myself I'd go on a shorter walk, maybe half an hour or so, just to stretch my legs. I stuck closer to camp this time, wandering along a narrow footpath that looped back around a few hundred meters away. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything unusual, but when I got back to my tent, I noticed something small and strange. One of the guy lines was unhooked, loose and slack, like it had been intentionally unclipped. I always double-checked those when I set up. They don't just come undone on their own. especially when the others were still tight. It was like someone had come by and undone it quietly. I stood there for a minute, looking around the woods in every direction. The quiet felt different now. Before, it had felt calm. Now it felt like something was holding its breath. I packed up most of my gear that afternoon, stuffed it into the car, and decided I'd just sleep one more night and head out early in the morning. I didn't start a fire that night, didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the tent and read, occasionally glancing at the fabric whenever I thought I heard a noise outside. I turned the light off early, just laid there in the dark, listening. It must have been around 3 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of slow footsteps outside the tent. Not animals, not the quick scurry of foxes or deer. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. I stopped breathing. My heart felt like it had jumped into my throat. I could feel every pulse in my body. The steps moved around the tent, slow, pacing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I don't even think I blinked. Then the zipper on the front of the tent moved slightly. Not unzipped, just a twitch, like someone had pressed a finger to it. And then nothing. I laid there frozen for over an hour. No more steps.
No sounds.
Just the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly outside, I threw everything into my backpack, took down the tent in record time, and bolted for the car. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to check the clearing. I just got in the car and drove. I didn't go back for months. When I finally did tell a friend about it, they asked me why I didn't report it. But what would I have said? That some guy stood outside my tent? That I heard footsteps? There was no crime, nothing I could prove. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And the part that stuck with me the most, the detail I didn't mention to anyone until much later, was that, in the faint morning light, as I'd walked back down the trail toward the car, I noticed something in the mud. A set of footprints. Large, deep. They hadn't been there the day before. They were pointed toward where my tent had been. I haven't camped alone since.